Lyra always had too many opinions to be a perfect soldier. Luckily, Aline never wanted the perfect soldiers. She valued the opinions of her men and women. This wouldn't have been a good tactic for everyone, but of course, a woman such as Aline rarely struggled with discipline problems. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 7. The Journey. Alira. Coup de grace. "I'm here to talk to you about a coup de grace," Aline said as she entered into Caden's quarters. "Or just a coup," she whispered as Alira threw her feet over the side of Caden's bed. "Or both." Caden had long since left on his trip, 5 minutes after dawn. "I'm all ears," Alira answered, back, shaking the grogginess from her mind. "Well, I hope not," Aline said slyly, leaning against the frame of the door. "I might need more than just your ears." She examined Alira's naked form as she stood from the bed. "Fun night?" Aline asked. Alira responded with a glare that told her fun might not have been the appropriate word. "I'm afraid it was a touch more intimate than that," Alira remarked as she attempted to find her clothes. Unfortunately, most of her previous outfit was in tatters. "Just a touch?" Aline asked doubtfully. "Oh, never mind. It might be for the best anyway." "Oh?" Alira asked as she pulled on a pair of ripped pants after she'd already thrown on what was left of her shirt. "Well, maybe if the two of you have something to live for, you'll try harder to stay alive." "Yes, 'cause that worked out so well last time," Alira remarked with disdain. "Speaking of last time," Aline began leadingly. Alira froze, and the look in her eyes took a faraway cast before she returned and answered pointedly. "I don't want to talk about last time." "Did he?" Aline prodded. "Want to talk about last time?" "I told him to leave it alone, and he did," Alira finished as she walked up and stood toe-to-toe with Aline. "Really was quite nice of him, wouldn't you say?" Aline got the point as she smiled with practiced harmlessness before gesturing for them both to walk through the door. "So we're deposing Varen, I take it?" Alira asked quietly as they strode through the halls. They were in the Elathian barracks that had been generously partitioned off from the rest of the castle. "Rain is succeeding Varen," Aline corrected. "Rain might not like that idea so much," Alira countered. "She doesn't," Aline responded curtly. "Caden won't like it either. You know how he is." "That," Aline responded, raising a finger, "is why Caden is out of town." "And then who will Rain confide in when she feels like throwing herself off the nearest cliff from guilt of killing her own father?" Alira asked bluntly. "Oh, who says Varen has to die?" Aline asked, raising an eyebrow. Alira responded by simply returning the look. Aline blinked first. "That is why we'll do it right before Caden gets back," Aline finished. "This sounds like it's far too likely to go to hell," Alira remarked calmly. "I don't like it. And frontline soldiers don't like getting shot in the face. Sometimes things have to be done, and we don't get what we like." Aline stopped walking as she finished. Alira stopped a few steps later and turned to face Aline. They were only a few meters from Alira's quarters. "How long do we have?" "About a week, and get some rest." Aline did a smart-about face before commenting over her shoulder. "That's an order." Alira rolled her eyes before turning to her doors. "And don't roll your eyes at me," Aline shouted before turning the corner.
Caden, Fears, and Bridget. Watching the three of them was fun. A vision, perhaps. Something meant to be. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 7. Continued. Caden. Staying positive. "Dark, cold, wet, and fucking miserable," Bridget grumbled as she picked her way through the growth. "I don't suppose seasons really exist around here, huh?" "Sure they do," Fears responded with his usual amount of cheer. "We have cold." "Cold? There was one more." He stopped to rub his stubble ponderously before exclaiming, "Oh yes, cold." "You forgot about cold," I shouted over my shoulder. "Damn it, I always miss that one," Fears muttered to himself, purposely loud enough for us to hear. "Well, terrible weather is better than terrible company," I heard Bridget concede from behind me as I picked my way through some treacherously slippery mud. Days seemed to pass like minutes on journeys like this, which seemed to be composed of long bouts of idleness, punctuated by brief moments of sheer terror. More than once, we'd come across a patrol of corpses with 1 or 2 Anarans at the head. Dispatching them would have been far too likely to expose us, so we'd opted for avoidance. Covered in leaves and mud, diving in bushes, laying in trenches, holding our collective breaths underneath freezing cold water and practically frozen pools. It had been less than a vacation, but we were close. Another day, maybe 2, and we'd be there. I kept my hopes low about what we'd find. They'd have a shorter way to fall that way. "So what'll we find when we get there, Caden?" Fears asked as he fell in step beside me. "Corpses. Just not sure whose," I answered curtly. Normally I'd be tasked with keeping up morale, but not with Fears. I could be honest with him. "Doesn't sound like a very positive outlook," Bridget commented from behind. "It's not," I responded with as much warmth as I could manage. "But it's honest."
So much love contained between 2 beings. It should be noted just how drawn Caden was to her, even though to his mind, he didn't know her at all. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 7. Continued. Alira. Old Times. It hadn't been pretty the first time. War never was, but it had been gritty even by the standards of all-out warfare. Hardly any of the buildings had been left standing. Hell, hardly any of the people had been left standing. Alira lay alone in Caden's quarters. Technically, she shouldn't have been there, but she didn't think Caden would have minded. At least the old him wouldn't have. They'd been together for almost a year the last time around, quite the extended mission in comparison to most Alathian operations. Neither of them had known, of course, that there was anything outside of the mission. She'd missed him so much, fought desperately to be part of the battle here. She'd known he wouldn't remember her, but she hadn't known how much that would hurt. They didn't train you for that sort of thing. Gunfire had been everywhere, explosions, fire, death, and yet they'd almost made it. The objective had been to hold the city as long as possible, and protect civilians at all costs. She rolled over onto her side, pressing her face into his pillow, and drawing a deep breath in through her nose. She wanted him here, with her now, but his smell and her imagination would have to suffice for at least a few more days. This time, he'd remember. Aline had promised her he'd remember if only they could succeed. They would win. She would win. For him. For us.
Necromancy. Is it even possible? Alpha certainly seems to prove so. It is odd to observe the powers granted to certain Alathians and Anarans. The magic seems to follow the personality of the users to some extent. Caden, ice. Bridget, fire. Aline, access to the mind. Alpha, well, Alpha's power seems to follow necessity. What could he have needed more at Varen's Keep than numberless soldiers? Some, mostly myself, believe that in the Gatharan mountain range he developed the power of suicide. How else could he have made it out? What else could he have possibly needed more? The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 7. Continued. Caden. Arrival. I'd been wrong about the city. There were no corpses, only ash and rubble, and all of a sudden I wasn't wondering where Alpha got his men from. I didn't know why we hadn't given it much thought before. Now, it really didn't matter, though. We'd spent the day scouting through the city with wet cloths over our mouths. Not that it did much good. By the books, we'd been looking for survivors, but in truth, we were just satisfying the books. The only useful thing that had come out of the venture was the location of a suitable place to sleep. The roof was practically non-existent, but the walls, 3 of them anyway, were mostly standing. Bridget was inside, setting up bunks and rummaging through our supplies for a suitable meal. Unfortunately, it would all taste like ash anyway after a long day of choking on nothing but cinders. Fears had joined me outside of the front door, where I was surveying the surroundings. Immediately in front was a muddy street with rubble lining the sides in an almost orderly line. The street ran left to right, ending in more rubble at both sides. Immediately after a battle, there were at least flames to present the mock image of life, but now, after it had been a good while since the attack, nothing remained but darkness and dust. "A wasted trip?" Fears asked as he strode up beside me. "Not entirely," I responded with a little too much ice in my voice. "We satisfied any remaining curiosity." "I suppose that's something," he answered back. All of the cheer was gone from his voice this time. "Yeah," I responded in more of a soft breath than even a whisper. "It is something." "How long ago do you think?" he asked in an equally soft voice. Don't know. That's not what concerns me, though, I said, turning to him, a bit of firmness returning to my voice. Where are all the bodies? You think that... the wolf? He really didn't know how to ask me if I believed in necromancy. I've seen stranger things, brother, I replied, thinking back to my experience in Alpha's lair. I felt my hand grow cold as I removed my glove, then showed him its pale glow. I've done stranger things. To Fierce's credit, he didn't even flinch. Of course, we were used to weird by then. It wasn't like a good Alathian man didn't already know some sort of magic existed, though I couldn't place why. It was just that we knew. Aline certainly had some strange abilities. Bridget, he started, but I didn't let him finish. There's something off about her. There's a damn lot of potential in that girl. Unfortunately, I don't think we found her by chance. She's here by design. She's not what you think, he said as he searched for his words to convince me that she wasn't a double agent. She's confused, I responded calmly. Lost and confused, and desperate to belong somewhere. I'll take first watch, I said, turning stiffly to face the rubble again. Go show her that she belongs with us. He nodded and left as I put the wet cloth back over my mouth and replaced my glove. It'd be a long night.
I, who observe all, find that there are some things an outsider should not observe. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 7. Continued. Bridget, a private party. Shouldn't work so hard, Fears mentioned casually as he strode through the door. We have to eat, she answered back, still shuffling through her bag. It's not like we're gonna taste anything, he said, picking some strange fruit out of the bag and tossing it in the air playfully. Actually, we'd be better off if we didn't taste anything. Ash, she said as she stood up and caught the fruit before Fears could. I know, she said as she took a bite and tossed it out of the crumbling building, making a face. It's fun to pretend, though. I was playing with that, he growled with a smile, bending down slightly, almost bumping her forehead with his. She said with a wink. Guess you'll have to find something new to play with. Any suggestions? He asked nonchalantly as she grabbed the front of his shirt with both hands. I may have an idea, she whispered as she grabbed the back of his shirt, lifting it up over her head in one fluid motion. She grabbed the back of her shirt, lifting it over her head in one fluid motion. Her scars still covered her body, glowing white and red in the darkness. I may have too, he answered playfully as he gripped her lower back, pulling her in closer. She leaned into him, giving him a firm, passionate kiss as she laced her fingers behind his head. Her lips felt like fire against his, and her breath tasted of cinnamon. Her body melted into his, the fire beneath her skin banishing the cold of the room. He began to unwrap her bandages as she undid his belt. They tumbled around on the floor. Neither of them wore any semblance of clothing. So this isn't the part where you turn into some colossal tease, give me a soft kiss on the nose, and then saunter off, making sure to sway your hips as much as possible? Fears joked as he rolled on top of her, bracing himself with his left elbow and right knee as to not crush her beneath his weight. No, she whispered, poking his nose playfully. Silly boy, she commented as she pushed him over and wound up on top of him this time, straddling him in a fashion that emphasized her nakedness as well as his. This is the part where you go turn into some colossal ass and tell me, now's not the time. She bit back in a mockingly deep tone. He grabbed her by her hips, feeling their warmth radiate through his hands, only partially covering the long white scar on her left side that glowed and burned with a fire-like heat. I won't if you won't, Fears almost grunted as he tried to keep his thoughts straight. The 4 red scars on her stomach glowed ruby red, the same color as the cut on her left cheek. Even the intricate white lines beneath her eyes glowed with a soft white intensity. Above all else, though, the bloody handprint on her chest glowed a deep, dark crimson red. She leaned in to kiss him, but stopped just short of his lips, taking his breath away with the warmth of hers brushing his lips softly. Deal, she whispered as the inside of her thighs pressed against the outside of his, almost overwhelming his senses, as she lowered himself onto him. Fears's body filled with an intense heat as he lay beneath her, brushing her cheek with his right hand and pulling her into a long kiss. He rolled over, rolled her over, holding himself just slightly above her, leaning down to kiss her neck. He worked his way lower to her defined collarbone before noticing that the handprint had all but disappeared. She grabbed him softly by his hair, leading him back to her lips. She was far from done with him, and they were far from finished.
So rarely does one find a being that can accept such news with dignity. Aline is a most special and unique woman, one in billions or trillions perhaps. Caden was a lucky man to have such a woman in his proximity. So too were the other Alathians, I suppose. If anyone had the power to hold on to Bridget, it was Aline. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 7. Continued. Aline. The bearers of bad news. "What are you doing here?" Aline asked the mostly silent room as she sat calmly in her quarters. She held a steaming cup in her right hand, resting her left on the side table, which hosted a plain teapot. "Why can I never sneak up on you?" the young boy asked as he picked his way from the shadows. "Because I'm awesome," Aline said with a small smile. "That's my line," he said with no small amount of menace as he worked his way to the table. Despite the frigid temperature, he still wore only his pajama bottoms without a shirt. His hair as ruffled as ever in its faux hawk style. "Oh, is it?" she asked mockingly. "Well, I do apologize. Here, have a seat," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite of her. "Don't do it," he almost growled. "Would you like some tea?" she said with complete seriousness. "Where's Glockenstein, by the way?" "Look, you may be able to steal my lines, but you cannot have my potato," he began as Glockenstein dropped from the ceiling deftly, landing on the table without disturbing the tea. "Right here, my lady. It's good to see you. No less the formidable warrior from what I've heard of the bridge battle," he said flatteringly as he took a knee and bowed his, potato. "My skills but pale in comparison to yours," she responded, gesturing for him to stand. "I hear you kicked the wolf from his lair." "There were a few holes in his defense, my milady," Glockenstein responded after a pause. "Well, don't just stand there," she said, gesturing towards herself. Glockenstein eagerly walked towards her. "That's enough!" the Jacobin yelled, reaching forward and grabbing Glockenstein before pulling him close to his chest and petting the top of his being. "You can have my lines, but you cannot have my potatoes, and you will never have my crazy," the Jacobin said as he curled up on top of his chair, holding Glockenstein close. Alina was quiet for a moment as she looked away before turning back to him. She tilted her head slightly to the side and then screwed up her face in a most horrifying, crazy look a human could deliver, before sticking out her tongue and jumbling out the words, "Are you sure?" The Jacobin yelped and jumped back, only succeeding in causing the chair to fall backwards with him still in it. Aline laughed quietly at first, dignified as always, before losing it and laughing wholeheartedly. "Oh, you always know how to lighten the mood after a long day of plotting," Aline purred as she stood and looked down at the Jacobin, who'd made himself rather comfortable in his position on the floor, hardly looking as though he'd fallen at all. "Now why are you here?" she hissed, taking a knee beside him. He ruffled up his hair as one would normally brush off their suit after something undignifying occurred. "I was just here to tell you to prepare," the Jacobin answered as the room spun, leaving him standing, and Alira falling back against the wall that had now somehow become the floor. It almost winded her. "The wolf is coming," he said as he jumped and spun in the air as the floor promptly became the floor again, and Aline fell to her hands and knees. "And how will the battle end?" she asked as she flipped her hair so that she could see him clearly from her position on the ground. "Whatever should happen will," he said with a maniacal smile. Glockenstein spoke from his new position, standing on the Jacobin's shoulder. "Goodbye, my lady," he said with a small nod that was more dignified and rigid than any salute. There was an odd air of finality to that goodbye as they both evaporated into bubbles and feathers that floated gently to the floor before bursting into flames and dissipating into smoke. The room was silent again as Aline sat back on her table, her tea still completely undisturbed, despite the spinning of the room. She reached for her cup, but noticed her shaking hand. She glared at it as the shaking became a quiver, and then finally stopped. "Goodbye, Glockenstein," she whispered as she lifted her cup to her lips. "It's been fun."
Was it Aline's voice that he actually heard, or just a hunch? Caden has always been good with those things, hunches. Says he follows his gut, whatever the devil that could possibly mean. Of course it was Aline. We just finished talking about supernatural powers, did we not? The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 7. Continued. Caden. Now. I patrolled the burnt streets that had long since abandoned my cloth. It had been practically inundated with ash, so the damn thing wasn't going to help me any longer. It was just as likely to asphyxiate me as anything. My footsteps were muffled by the layers of soot, adding to the silence that had seemingly swallowed the city. I rested my hand on the hilt of my sword, tense, ready, but unafraid. Ahead, something caught my attention. A small building with largely intact walls and caved-in windows loomed with the door swinging open and shut eerily in the wind. A sound came from within, but it wasn't a sound I'd have expected to find in a dead city. A soft melody played, trickling through the windows and cracks in the walls. I knew that I should run, and yet it drew me in. I stumbled forward, step by wavering step. I felt my heart sinking as my hand touched the frame of the door. Thunder cracked through the sound of the rain, and the city was gone. Around me, explosions rang in unison with the cries of men and the beat of drums. I was in the center of the room now, yet I couldn't remember passing through the door. The dark sounds became louder and louder, ringing inside of my mind as more explosions sounded from outside. Gunshots. I fell to my knees, grabbing the sides of my head, tearing into the flesh of my temples with my nails as the music grew louder. "Think of Elaine," I heard her say as I closed my eyes and pictured Elaine. I heard her crisp voice giving concise orders, saw her standing in front of me in her unceremonious armor, a feline deviousness in her sharp blue eyes. The gunshots faded, but the music did not. "Think of me." Her slender form crouching in the rain, her hood pulled back, revealing her sharply featured face, mouth open and eyes closed as she attempted to track the wolf with me. "Think of us, you and me, together." I felt her cool breath against my lips. I saw her sharp blue eyes staring past me as into memories only she had. I felt the warmth of her skin against mine. The music faded as I remembered what we had promised. I am yours, and you are mine. Nothing else matters. I added as I stood slowly, but with determination. The music stopped, and I heard nothing but silence, not even the falling of the rain outside. I knew why I was where I was. I was an Alathian man, and I would not be swayed by Alpha or anything else. "You have to leave," I heard Aleene's voice whispering in my mind. It was impossible, but I felt like it wasn't the first time she'd done this. "He's coming," she whispered, the whisper almost seeming to carry on an errant wind as it brushed against me. "Caden, now!" she ordered as the wind swung the door open. I walked to the door briskly before pausing in the frame. What the hell was a gunshot? And why did I know that word?
Holes. More like unattended portals. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 7. Continued. Bridget. Eviction. "I'm on my way," Alpha's voice whispered in her ear as her eyes snapped open. She stood in the rain, on an open field of grass. Behind her were only trees, and in front an army of corpses, with the occasional crimson-clad figure wandering through the ranks. Alpha stood to her right. "What happened to the lair?" Bridget asked nonchalantly with her jaw set as she turned to face him. Standing naked in the freezing rain and not shivering was quite a challenge. "There were some..." Alpha paused as if remembering something he hadn't. "Holes in my defenses," he growled menacingly. "Huh," she said, feigning understanding. "I need you back at the castle before the attack," he said, returning from whatever place the memory had taken him. "Why?" she asked the obvious question. "Because you, my dear, are going to open the gates for me," he smiled. "How would you even bridge the gap?" she asked quietly. "They'll knock down the temporary route before you even get close." "I have an army of corpses in a forest. Do you really think I can't build a bridge?" Alpha sighed. "But that is not the biggest of my problems. You seem to be losing your way. Again," he growled, gesturing to the fading handprint on her chest. "This doesn't have to hurt, my dear," he said, running a claw under her chin, softly, pulling her gaze up to him. "But it will if it has to," he finished with a bite as he drew blood from the bottom of her chin. "How do I even get them to leave this city fast enough? Caden's orders dictate a 3-day tour at least." "Oh, don't worry," he said, turning to the rain and laughing softly. I have the eviction handled. Now go. With that, she was gone, falling through a place too dark and yet too light before she found herself, her body finally releasing the scream that had been bottled up inside of her.
Planning seems to be such a joke sometimes. Why do people even bother? Once upon a time I tried to plan things. Just a simple picnic on the grass. Before long I was knee-deep in Brooklyn corpses, the sun had supernovaed, and the world was cracking apart at the seams. All according to plan. But I'd forgotten the crackers. It was then that I realized that plans were useless. Utterly useless. Like a hamster without a head. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 7. Continued. Alira. Planning. We need to plan, Alira mentioned nonchalantly as she passed by Aline in her oversized chair. Why is it always here? Aline asked, looking away from the fire blazing in the hearth. What? Alira asked, taking a seat on the couch, said to be made of the back hair of angels. The calm before the storm always takes place in this damned library, Aline sighed. Maybe we should avoid the library, Alira suggested with a non-committal shrug. Then the storms might never end. Just because it's calm in the eye of the storm, Alira started, doesn't mean the storm ever stopped, I know, Aline said wistfully, staring back into the fire. So, our plan? Alira prodded, none too gently. You guys really are perfect for each other. She had almost literally purred through the word perfect. Yes, I'm sure we're adorable, Alira said as she almost rolled her eyes, but stopped herself short. No, it's just all business with the two of you, she said as if deep in thought. Most people would say the same of you, Alira answered back coldly. I'm not this damn tired around most people. Aline smiled back, looking every bit as tired as she claimed to be. Awkward silence reigned for a few moments before she broke it. The plan is simple. 3 of us say that we're going to have a talk with Varen, and we seek a peaceful resolution. And if peaceful resolutions aren't an option, Alira asked leadingly, then we explore other options. Other options? Alira asked, raising an eyebrow. Aline sighed in response. We kill everyone, and then we put Varen's bloody crown on Rain's head, and hope that she handles the stress better than her father. And if she doesn't, she will. Aline responded coolly, apparently unwilling to sanction the slaughter of the entire royal family. Alira smiled pleasantly. What? Aline asked, noticing the smile. For a second there, I thought you were going to say kill her too. That would have been a problem, Aline asked, raising an eyebrow. Am I speaking frankly? Alira probed cautiously. When don't you? Aline laughed back. Yes, that would have been a problem, Alira responded as she stood. Going to have to move up the timetable on this one, Aline almost shouted over her shoulder. Why is that? Alira asked, pausing in her steps. Because Caden's going to be home early. Alira didn't ask how Aline knew this. Nobody ever did. This could get awkward, Alira sighed. It probably will, Aline agreed. Be prepared for that eventuality. With that, Alira left, leaving Aline to stare at the fire once again. Dismissed, Defender, she whispered under her breath in Alira's wake.
Supernova-ed, Supernovad, Supernovified, had gone supernova? Oh, who cares? These are my observations anyway, and I'll do what I please. See what I did there? I didn't capitalize the I in Isle. Just try and stop me. I'm a madman. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 7. Continued. Caden. Getting to the perimeter. Leaving now, I yelled, bursting into the room as Bridget awoke screaming. We have to leave, she exclaimed, looking around wildly as she grabbed onto Fierce's arm. Fierce looked from me to her, and then back at me. I think we should be moving, he said, with just a sprinkle of panic hiding in his eyes. I agree, I said with a nod to both of them. Get dressed. I'll be out front. I burst back into the rain and dropped into a crouch, scanning the street from left to right. Burnt wood creaked and rain pattered into large, glowing puddles that formed beside the luminescent blue river in the street. I closed my eyes and listened. I heard Bridget, of course, frantically relating the dream she'd had of the wolf in the clearing. Her story indicated that the wolf expected her to open the gate for him, and she was worried she'd be without choice. I knew where she wouldn't be stationed during the coming battle. Her voice, however, was not what I was listening for. I heard it, in the distance, smelled it over the bittersweet scent of damp earth and soaked ash. I heard the croaking of corpses that couldn't quite breathe as they stalked the city, sensed the smell of death long overdue that clung to their rotting flesh. I opened my eyes and turned sharply to the left, just as 3 corpses rounded the corner with an Anaran woman at their head. She was covered from head to toe in crimson-red cloth, turned to a dark and bloody color by the wetness of the downpour. Her mask was a simple cloth that covered her face down the bridge of her nose. She wore 2 swords on her hips, and the creatures only held crude maces. I turned to the door and threw it open with one hand, whilst keeping a wary eye on the figures down the street. "Now!" I hissed as they both turned to look at me. Bridget wasn't quite finished getting dressed, and wore only her wrappings on her upper body, though her lower was covered. Fierce's shirt was in his hands, but the damn thing was beyond wearing, so he just grabbed his cloak and handed Bridget hers. They collected their weapons as they left through the front door. "Company," Fierce noticed as he stepped out. "Get to the perimeter," I whispered sharply, though this was usually the part where my comrades would say something like, "No, don't go," or "But, Commander." I'd cut them off with a heroically cocky smile and say, "That's an order, XO." My men knew better. I had this handled, and Fierce damn well knew it. So with a nod of his head, he took off, trailing Bridget behind him and leaving me alone amidst the falling rain in the street. I straightened my back and stretched my shoulders as I casually walked to the center of the road. I drew my sword since I really didn't feel like playing with the woman's pets for an extended period of time. The creatures stumbled forward in an awkward, jumbled mess, clinging to their maces with rotted fingers, their lower jaws awkwardly swung left and right with their steps, barely holding together by the failing cartilage adhering to the rest of their faces. The short sword I'd brought along for this adventure felt light in my hand as its silvery blue metal almost glowed and dripped water steadily. I walked towards them at a steady pace as the first approached, bringing its mace down in a stroke meant for the right side of my head. I ducked beneath the blow, crouching down while using the creature's own slight forward momentum to toss it over my shoulder. The next 2 came in quick succession, the first of which swung its mace horizontally. I parried the blow back in the direction it had come from before deflecting it down and roughly from the creature's grip. I brought my sword across its right knee as the rotting flesh parted like warm butter. The sword tugged only briefly as it tore through the sinew holding the knee together as the creature fell onto its other knee, screaming hoarsely as the second creature came to bear. I needed this done quickly, so I caught its strike by reaching out with my gloved right hand and blocking the blow by slamming my forearm into its wrist that was coming at me in another clumsy horizontal swing. I followed up with a straight stab into the creature's chest. I tore the blade free as the creature stumbled back. Then I turned the sword around in my hand so that I held it facing behind me before stabbing it through the fleshy meat of the back of the kneeling creature's head. The first one that had come, by some welcome twist of fate, had landed on its neck, leaving it twitching and heaving in the mud sporadically. My blade had already been washed clean by the rain, but I habitually ran the flat side of its length on my right sleeve, flipped it, then repeated the process as I took a slow, steady steps towards the Anaran woman. "Where is he?" I asked calmly, regulating my breathing and inflections. "Why?" she asked with a muffled voice before tearing off the hood that covered her thick brown hair that she kept in a tight bun, and pulled down the cloth that had muffled her voice. She wasn't particularly memorable by her features. She was attractive, but given other circumstances, she'd have just been another face in the crowd. "You looking to get your ass beat again?" she asked in a slightly accented voice. "Not here, then," I answered with a small smile. My estimates on the likelihood of escape had just gone up. "No," she answered with a grimace. "You don't really think you can beat me?" I asked, confused by her hesitation. "Not here to stop you," she said, meeting my eyes. "I only have to slow you down," she finished with a grim smile as she drew her swords. "You don't have to," I said with a sigh, twirling my swords around again and dropping into stance. She appeared to ponder that thought for a moment, before she gave a non-committal shrug, and charged.
I wouldn't have wanted those two women coming to kill me if I were Varen, I'll tell you that. Of course, I'm not Varen, and it probably wouldn't be much of an inconvenience. Though one really never knows with Aline. She surprised me more than once. Well, as surprised as I get, anyway. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 7. Continued. Aline. It begins. Though the time of day never changed this far below the surface, the dead of night always felt all the more abysmal in the barracks. Something about the fact that there was no sun anywhere really seemed to cause the torches to cast deeper shadows. Aline, however, was accustomed to being in dark, uncomfortable places, and by comparison, this was a luxury resort. She approached Alira's barracks to knock, but found the door already open. Not surprising, she muttered to herself as she peered in through the doorway. Alira was already dressed in her gray and blue armor. Her cloak hung around her neck loosely, and she held her bow firmly in her right hand. A quiver of arrows rested against her left hip, and part of her cloak tucked behind it. Aline knew from experience that there were 2 additional daggers hidden on her right thigh by the cloak. "Shall we go wake the princess?" Aline asked as she noticed Aline whilst tying her hair in a loose ponytail. "Queen," Aline corrected, double-checking the placement of her own sword on her right hip. "Not yet," Alira re-corrected as she finished and strode up to Aline. "It's inevitable," Aline responded with a sly smile playing on her lips. "Let's move." Alira gave a curt nod as Aline turned abruptly and swirled out of the room, blue cloak billowing for a second behind her. Alira followed suit, taking up a position just behind her and to her right.
I've never particularly enjoyed everyone else's way of killing. It's messy and prolonged, and altogether very little fun. In all honesty, I rarely enjoyed anyone else's way of doing anything. What is wrong with confetti and butterflies, I ask you? Why so much blood and sadness all the time? I know why. Doesn't mean I like it, though. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 7. Continued. Caden. Killing. This was taking too long, and I knew it. Her advantage was the 2 swords. Mine was the additional power I could pack behind my blows. She was skilled, however, and kept my benefits at bay by pressing an almost constant attack. I deflected the blows to the best of my abilities, giving ground until I felt my back press against the wall behind me. She finally went in for a rather unconventional strike, aiming an X at my neck, which I caught with my blade just short of its mark. The sword sparked as I slid mine up so the hilt would be closer to my neck, helping me push against her strength. "Don't make me," I grunted, pushing forward, bracing my right foot against the wall. "Finish it," she growled. I obliged her, turning my sword diagonally up and behind my head. Her X got just above my head as I dropped my sword and pushed off the wall, tackling her with my right shoulder against her lightly armored diaphragm. We crashed to the ground as I grunted, and she gasped for air as the air was pushed from her body. I wasn't particularly squeamish, but I couldn't help but remind myself of cold Alathian logic in moments like this. If I couldn't take her as a prisoner, I couldn't leave her alive. I drew back my less-than-armored fist and crashed it down on the bridge of her nose, letting training take over and the rest of me detach from what I was doing as hot blood spurted like a fountain and she gasped and almost screamed. I crashed my fist down again, bringing forward a dizzied expression as she rocked her head back and forth. I'd felt a few teeth come loose from the last blow, but amidst the blood gushing from her mouth and nose, there was no way of knowing for sure. I wrapped my hands around her neck with just as much force as I could manage, as clarity returned to her vision. She cried at first, clawing at my face. I grunted in return, squeezing my eyes shut against her nails. I felt her neck giving way under my grip as her feeble clawing, painful though it was, faded away. She grasped at my fingers lightly, trying to pull my hands free to no avail. I opened my eyes and looked down at her as her gentle groping became even softer. Her eyes watered and bulged slightly as the blood from her face seeped down onto my hands, making my grip fail. She pleaded with her eyes, staring straight into mine. My hold slipped suddenly as my hands fell into the mud. She took a deep, rasping breath, and some lucidity returned to her eyes. It didn't last long before I fell with my left forearm bearing down onto her throat. She cried and pleaded loudly at first, begging for me to stop. Words like, "not again," drifted through the garbled gurgling and crying. I put all of my weight into the press, squeezing my eyes shut and angling my forearm before pushing with all my might. There was a slight pull in the tendons and muscles beneath my weight. Then there was a sickening twang before the following crack that signaled the end of her life. I fell to my side in the mud, careless of the mess it would make. As my chest heaved, I gulped in the cold, humid air, running my hand through my hair with her blood still hot upon them. I resisted the urge to scream at the clouds as I rolled back over on my hands and knees. My face stung from the numerous small cuts and scratches she'd inflicted. I coughed a few times as my hands were washed clean by the glowing mud and rain, bringing myself to one knee slowly before collecting my blade and wiping it on my sleeve and sheathing it. I walked over to her still form. I gave her a brief salute and whispered words of respect before slipping away into the city. I had to get to the outskirts, quickly.
Rain's Reign. That would have been a good title for a chapter in a history book. The Observations of an Over-Observed Observationist.
Chapter 7. Continued. Alira. Convincing the Queen. Alira leaned with her back against the wall of the left of Rain's door. Aline was inside, giving her some sort of last-minute pep talk. She did a good job of pretending that Varen would actually surrender. They both knew better, though. And Alira was pretty sure that Rain did, too. Alira toyed with the feathered ends of the arrows in the quiver on her hip, spinning one around and around, trying to pass the time before they'd be on the move again. Coups really did make a woman nervous. Her bowstring was taut and ready, and she'd already checked her knives 3 or 4 times. They'd been taught not to do that sort of thing on account of the fact that their nervousness would make them more likely to mess something up the 4th or 5th time they revisited it. But at times like this, she found that she often just didn't care. Finally, Rain stepped from the room with her jaw set and back straight, ready to go. She nodded curtly at Alira before starting off at a quick pace. Rain joined soon after stepping from the room warily, as if she expected to be attacked at any moment from every side. She held the typical Alathian kite shield, though the female model was a bit smaller, and wore both sword and dagger on her left hip. She almost jumped when Alira placed her right hand on her back and patted reassuringly. "Stick close and let Aline do the talking," Alira advised, forcing Rain to make eye contact before delivering a reassuring smile. "I'll have your back, and you'll be wearing a crown in time for Caden's return." "That's what worries me," Rain whispered, looking down and to the side. "I know it's hard," Alira spoke back in a hushed tone, "but we're here to make the hard choices for those that cannot." Alira finished, placing a gloved hand underneath Rain's chin and pulling up her gaze. "For your land, for your people, and for your father," she said in a soft crescendo. "Can you do this?" "Yes," Rain nodded with more surety in her voice this time. "Good," Alira smiled, giving Rain a playful slap on the left side of her face. "Cade'll be proud," Alira finished as they started off to catch up to Aline. "Will he?" Rain asked no one in particular as she fingered the knife on her hip. She steeled herself and took off after the other 2 women.
I grow tired of holding your hand. I'll be along again shortly, if I feel like it. Until then, pay attention! Wouldn't want you to miss anything. The Observations of an Over-Observed Observationist.
Chapter 7. Continued. Caden. Indubitably. I was happy to have reached the outskirts as quickly as I did. What didn't make me happy was finding Bridget and Fears holed up in a crumbling house on the very furthest reaches of the city that happened to be on a small hill overlooking the kilometer of clearing before the forest. I forced my way through the door, which was marked by a cross that Fears had carved into it for me to notice. I was rather anxious to hear his explanation. "You knew better than to wait for me," I commented as they turned to face me. I knew I was stained with blood and soaked by the rain, but they took my appearance in stride. "No shit, Commander," Fears answered back, gesturing for me to join him at the window. "There's just a slight problem we have here." I looked out the window, expecting exactly what I saw. There were hundreds of corpses milling about the clearing, just waiting for us to inevitably try and escape the city. "Well, damn," I whispered, absently running my fingers over the pommel of my sheathed sword. "That's what I said," Bridget piped in from her position near the door. Well, I started, tearing my gaze away from the window and looking at Fears and then Bridget. I don't like that look, Bridget remarked steadily as she stood and walked over to us with her seductive gait. This is going to be bloody, Fears asked, looking straight at me. Isn't it? Indubitably, I answered with a devious smile. Nice word, Fears commented nonchalantly, smiling back. Thank you, I answered. A whole 5 syllables by my count, I added, pretending to use my fingers to count it out. Well, for us less articulate ones, Bridget started, namely me, can we keep it a little more monosyllabic from now on? There'll be blood, Fears answered her as she began to smile as well. Not many other options, I sighed, turning back to Fears. Time to run? Bridget asked. Like proverbial bats out of hell, Fears answered back as we all exchanged glances. We'd have made a decent little squad, if I didn't expect one of us of incomparable treachery. Chapter 7 continued. Alira and Caden. The first strokes. Things like this took planning. It took bribes, threats, promises, promotions, demotions, fake orders, and intimate knowledge of each of the guardsmen and where their loyalties lay, if it was to be done right. Luckily, with Rain being the daughter of the Lord, and the Lord being one insane order away from getting himself deposed, the transition was far more likely to be smooth. Not to mention the fact that Alathian soldiers were welcome to visit the Lord whenever they damn well pleased, carrying whatever instruments of violence and death they saw fit. All in all, the worst-case scenario called for 7 deaths. 6 royal guards loyal to Varen alone, and Varen himself would just about foot that bill. Varen would already be in the throne room, and the guards posted at the door were collateral, no matter how this played out. The 4 inside would be dispatched the second Aline made her offer and Varen refused. At that point, Varen would either surrender, or Alira would bury an arrow in his throat. The 3 women had made it to the final bend in the passageway before reaching the throne room, when Aline and Rain quietly unsheathed their weapons, and Alira notched her first arrow. Rain wasn't likely to resist the plan until it came down to her father's life, and hopefully by that point it'd be too late for her to interfere anyway. You two don't seem the type that need an inspirational speech, I said it in a muffled tone as we clung to the side of the house we'd very recently been in. The rain still peppered us lightly, but the wind kept it falling more heavily on the other side of the house. No, sir, Fears answered for both of them. Everyone clear on the plan, then? I asked, gripping and re-gripping my unsheathed sword. Fears' nervous tick was apparently rubbing off on me. I glanced down at the field of corpses below as a knot tied in my stomach. This wasn't going to work. What plan? Bridget asked jokingly. Exactly, I whispered back with a thumbs up, gesture, and a wink. On the count of 3, I whispered as we all took our last full tastes of air. 1, 2, 3. Aline whispered as she turned the corner, pulling free one of her throwing knives. Alira followed, after sidestepping out and drawing her bow back. She loosed her arrow only a second after Aline threw her knife. The brief whooshes of air were followed by wet thumps and muffled thuds as the newly made corpses slid down the wall and then to the floors. Rain's clothes felt hot and scratchy against her skin as she attempted to loosen the collar with her right hand, finally starting around the corner. Her body was covered in a layer of uncomfortable sweat, and her sword and shield felt as though they weighed 100 kilos each. She steeled herself and turned around the corner, and then promptly lost her shit. Desrin, she whispered, looking at the body to her left as she bent over, resting her hands on her knees. Verum, she finished, noticing the body on the right. She took deep, shallow breaths as her eyes welled up with tears and nausea overcame all her other senses. She lost it all over the ground. Aline nodded for Alira to do something. Alira came to a stop just before Rain, crouching down to her level. Rain, she said in a low voice, we need... She stopped, taking a panicked and shaking breath. They need help. No, they don't, Alira responded coolly. But, she said, shaking again, they're hurt. No, Rain, Alira answered again. No, they aren't. She started again. You need to pull it together, Alira hissed. It wasn't that she was out of patience so much as it was the only thing to be done. They're dead, she hissed. Fucking dead, she said, grabbing Rain's chin roughly. Dead as goddamn doornails, understand? Rain nodded cautiously. It had to be done, and you were complicit in it? Alira said, softening her gaze and tone. If we're going to make it through this to the morning, we'll all need to be on the same page. The deed is done, and the pieces are in motion. Are you with us? Yes, Rain answered in an almost completely controlled sob. Say it with me, then. Alira ordered, standing up straight as Rain did the same. They're dead? They're dead, Rain whispered, looking away and wiping her face on her sleeve. Look at me, Alira ordered, apparently not satisfied. Right in the eyes. Rain did as she was told before mimicking Alira in her complete monotone. They're dead, Fears yelled as he yelled through the sounds of the fray. We're all dead. Pretty much, I yelled over my shoulder back at him. We were running at breakneck speeds through a field of animated corpses, cutting some down and bowling over others, all the while trying to avoid the various sharp objects being thrown or otherwise directed with force at us. What the plan lacked for in careful strategy, we made up for in tenacity and skill. To my right, Bridget danced through their ranks, severing tendons and other necessities. To my left, Fears was untouchable, using the bow to his fullest effect as a bludgeon, wincing every time he made contact. I used my weight and my sword to crash through those places that I couldn't run through, falling to the ground and rolling back to my feet repeatedly as we made the charge across the uneven, slippery ground. I zoned out almost completely over the course of the next few minutes, only to awake as I tripped on my way through the brush of the forest. Somehow, we'd made it. We all stumbled to our feet, weaving our way into the growth until we felt safely far enough from the creatures. We stopped for only a moment to allow Fears to catch up before we noticed the familiar bloody red color seeping through the forest. We were surrounded by at least 20 Anarans, which was hopefully the brunt of what was left of Alpha's forces. There was no escaping this one. I knew it, Fears knew it, and I could see from the dark expression on Bridget's face that she knew it too. Well, that was fun, Fears said, resting his hands on his knees and breathing raggedly. His remaining clothes were covered in blood and guts, hardly the Alathian blues and grays they'd been before. His face was covered in mud, just as I knew mine was from the earthy taste on my lips. The rain was washing it clean rapidly, but nothing could take away from the hilarity of his smile. I think I beat my time, Bridget added, bending down to touch her toes as if in a post-workout stretch. We're dead. I laughed, joining Fears and Bridget in their ridiculously out-of-place humor. Yes, we are. Fears joined in gleefully as he fell to his knees, breathless. The crimson-clad figures surrounded us, took no notes of our antics, fidgeting with their weapons as they waited for us to draw our own. Oh well, Bridget smiled affably. It really was a sweet ride, wasn't it? God, yes, Fears responded enthusiastically as he dropped his bow in the mud and drew his knives. Take as many of the fuckers down as you can, I said, gripping my sword as all the humor left my voice. Fears and Bridget's expressions darkened promptly as they walked towards me so we could cover each other's backs. Yes, sir. Rain's expression was dark and emotionless, which was as good as Alira felt she was likely to get. You good? She asked one last time as she turned her body towards the door, but kept her focus on Rain. Yes, Rain said, nodding her head curtly, gripping her sword and shield with renewed strength. I'm good. I would have to write a report on how it all happened later, and it was going to have to be a hell of a creative lie if I wanted to stay out of the psych ward. Nonetheless, we stood relatively unscathed, with the exception of Bridget's leg wound within the gates of the castle. What the? Fears began. Fuck. Bridget finished his question as I did a complete turn, getting my bearings back. Later, I stated firmly. Throne room, now. I ordered as I started running towards the entrance. They obeyed quickly and without hesitation, though Fears and I quickly outpaced Bridget due to her newer injury. We hit the stairs hard as I took in what we looked like. Somehow the rips and stains were gone from my uniform and Fears's had been completely replaced. Our injuries remained, however, and new stains were appearing in places that hid deeper cuts beneath. Now was not the time for reflection, though. Now was the time to run, and quickly. Chapter 7 continued. Alira and Caden. An arrow. Lord Varen, Aline announced as she entered the throne room with her retinue of 2 in tow. You are being relieved of your command. Rain will make an appropriate successor. She'd never been one for subtlety in these sorts of situations. Will she now? Varen asked, finally looking up from his position atop his throne. His sword was pressed point first into the ground as he spun it absently by the hilt. Baterish lay in a bloody pool at Varen's feet, lifeless eyes reflecting the soft torchlight that drifted down from the walls. "Father," Rain cried, taking a step towards Baterish's still form. "Silence!" Varen shouted, standing and gripping his sword as his four guards stepped forward to join him. They wore the colors of the city, in uniforms that were regal in appearance and effective in design. The armor protected all the critical areas without limiting mobility, and the gray cloths over their face, combined with the steel helms that left a wide Y shape, exposed for their ease of breathing and sight, only added to the intimidation. Their swords were not yet drawn. "Baterish was here only a moment ago with a very similar proposition," Varen remarked, as though the body wasn't still lying at his feet. "I didn't take kindly to what his words suggested," he growled. "You are no longer fit to rule," Aline replied, taking a non-committal step forward. Her entourage followed in suit. "So it's treason, then?" he whispered, almost to himself. "I prefer to think of it as a real allocation of power," Aline cut in, as Alira notched another arrow and drew her bow back. "Stand down." "Or what?" he asked with a sinister growl in the back of his throat. "You'll kill me?" he laughed. "That's the idea," Rain finally spoke. "Stand down, father. It's for the best." "Well, let's just see what my guards think of that, shall we?" he said in a tone that was hardly human. The guards stepped forward, drawing their blades as Alira landed an arrow in the open Y of the first one's helm. His head flew back from the recoil before he fell back in a crumpled heap. The second on Alira's side was moving too quickly for her to catch him with a properly placed arrow before he reached her, but she had other ways of dealing with him. Aline opted for a quick kill against one of the guards on Rain's side of the playing field via throwing knife to the face as she charged Varen. Their blades clashed, with Aline obviously the more skilled, though it looked like it would still take her time to wear through his defenses. Rain met her opponent with skill that was only outmatched by the guard's years of service. She held her own for a time, but found herself off balance after a strike with a gauntleted fist crashed into her sternum, leaving her on her knees. Alira took careful stock of the situation as her opponent approached, too quickly for her to alternate weapons. She sidestepped the first vertical slash to her right, drawing an arrow and bearing the head into the guard's exposed throat. The hit was a kill, but his muscle memory allowed him one last armored backhand that sent Alira's world spinning as she crashed to the ground, still clinging to her bow. Her vision swam, her ears rang. She pulled herself into a push-up position before finally getting to one knee. She swayed softly from side to side as she gripped her bow in her right hand, drawing an arrow with her left and stringing it. The room was still for a single second as she pulled back her bowstring and inhaled, hearing only her own breath. Aline had batted Varen's sword down and was going for a kill with a two-handed blow that seemed likely to behead the man. Unfortunately, Rain's opponent had found himself behind Aline, getting ready to bear his sword down on her back in an overhead chop. The two Rains that Alira's blurry vision registered were on their feet, moving to intercept, but there didn't seem like there was time for her to get between the man and Aline's exposed back. Perhaps Rain was close enough. Perhaps not. Maybe Aline could hit the man in her dazed state. Maybe she'd miss and hit Aline, who might die anyway if she didn't take the shot. Alira exhaled as she loosed the arrow. Hesitation was not a luxury afforded to people in her line of work. I paid the bodies outside the throne room no heed as I noticed how perfectly aimed the shots had been. I almost slipped in a pool of vomit as my mind repeated the fact that something terrible was happening, and I had to stop it. I drew my sword, nodding only briefly to Fears as he notched an arrow in his miraculously repaired bow, and we burst through the doors. Chaos and death greeted us. I was helpless as the scene froze before me. Aline's blade was just over halfway through beheading Varen, whose body was already reacting to the impact and falling limp. Rain stood between a guard and Aline's exposed back, pressing her blade hilt deep into the man's chest as his sword began to slip from his fingers, back behind his head. Alira was further towards the back of the room, having loosed an arrow in the direction of the fighting. Then it hit me. Alira's lopsided posture, Rain's breathless expression as she plunged her sword deeper. Alira hadn't known that Rain was going to make it in time. Hell, Rain hadn't even known, judging by the expression she was wearing. Alira must have been injured in the fight, meaning her aim was probably off. Something terrible was happening, and I was powerless to stop it. Rain almost smiled as her sword slid through the man in front of her. Everything had worked, and everything was fine. Or so she thought. An impact crashed against her ribs on the left side, knocking her back from the sheer force. She released her sword as the guard fell to his back in cadence with her own stumbling fall. Pain erupted through her in fiery tendrils that gripped her every muscle as she cried out, arching her back from the pain. She looked down at the source of the agony to see a shaft protruding from her lower chest. Fears had run and tackled Alira to the ground far too late as I sprinted forward, dropping to my knees and sliding to Rain's side as she noticed the shaft of the arrow. She reached to grab it with shaky hands, moaning in pain as I grabbed her hands and forced them away. No. My words jumbled out. Don't touch it. Get it out, she cried, still reaching for it. I looked to Aline, who'd already assessed the situation. The slow shaking of her head meant that there was nothing we could do. With that knowledge, I knelt over Rain with one knee on each side of her hips. I made Rain grasp my right hand with both of hers before ripping the arrow free with my left. She screamed in agony as I released my grip on her hands and tossed the arrow aside, grabbing the sides of her face with both of my hands. Her eyes fluttered open and closed as her sweat and tears flowed into my hands. Her lower lip trembled as she cried and attempted to suck air into a lung that now had a gaping hole in it. Easy there, I said with as much forced calm as I could manage. Calm, I whispered, pressing my forehead against her and looking her in her over-dilated eyes. I did the... She started before breathing in sharply and coughing as panic overtook her eyes. She stopped, heaving in a pained breath as her lip quivered and her back arched again beneath me. Right thing? She gasped. Yes, I answered wholeheartedly, brushing a tear from her left eye with my thumb. Yes, you did the right thing, I breathed, kissing her forehead softly. Of course you did. She moaned before she coughed and blood spurted from her lips, spraying my face, which I promptly ignored. My dad, she cried as she clenched her eyes in a sob as she inhaled sharply, lip quivering all the while. I want my dad back, she sobbed. You'll have him back, I whispered reassuringly, smiling through the tears that were beginning to form in my eyes. Just close your eyes, I whispered, running my free hand over her eyes gently. He's already waiting for you. Promise? She pleaded in the softest of voices. I promise, I whispered back. Now close your eyes, I finished. I pushed away the image of Varen's halfway decapitated corpse hovering in my peripheral vision. She looked as though she'd respond, but no answer came as she took one last shuddering breath before exhaling slowly as life drained from her eyes. I ran my right hand over them one last time, forcing them closed as I whispered once again. Just close your eyes. Bridget had finally reached the top of the stairs, dragging her injured leg behind her. She walked past the carnage before the throne room door, smelling something foul. She hadn't quite entered before Fears leaned in the doorway solemnly. I think a medic might be in order, he said quietly. Forget the medic. Bridget gasped back, wincing as her leg sent a new wave of pain shooting through her. We need a bloody miracle. Fears gave her a look that asked the obvious question. What now? The wolf, Bridget breathed softly. He's here.